Here's today's First Word Daily Devotion.
Here we are at February the 7th, and we turn our attention to an extended reading of Exodus here. You notice that in our text we have a lot of ground to cover in Exodus chapter 17 through 19. And so we'll focus our reading today on this narrative in Exodus chapter 17 through 19. And I just want to point out a couple of details to you. Notice here we have this pattern of grumbling that we want to keep in mind. Pattern of grumbling that we want to see. There was no water for the people to drink, we learn in verse 1. Therefore the people quarreled with Moses and said, "Give us water to drink." And then look at verse 4. Moses cried to the Lord, "What shall I do with this people? They are almost ready to stone me." And we're going to see this interaction with Moses and the people and God's interplay with them. Sometimes Moses will run out of patience. Other times it appears God runs out with patience with the people. And so just keep this in mind. I think the point of all of those things is to point us towards the heart of the people, especially this first generation. If your memory serves you as we're reading the Bible together, this generation that we're encountering doesn't enter the promised land. But notice the substance of their praying. Look at particularly at verse 7. They wanted to know, is the Lord among us or not? And then that question then is an important question for our reflection. It's going to become an important question later on as we see the children of Israel grumbling even further. The desire of the hearts of the people is to have, or the desire of our hearts should be, that we are with the Lord. You have God, remember, saying in the beginning of the Exodus that He is going to take Israel, and He will be their God, and they will be His people. Well, part of being the people of God means that you are in relationship with God. And that means, of course, that you desire Him to be with you and to be with Him. But that question in verse 7 is answered in the next section where we have this wonderful battle sequence where Moses, Aaron, and Hur went to the top of the hill. Verse 11, whenever Moses held up his hand, Israel prevailed. Whenever he lowered his hand, Amalek prevailed. But Moses' hands grew weary, so they took a stone, put it under him, and he sat on it, while Aaron and Hur held up his hands, one on one side and the other on the other side. So his hands were steady until the going down of the sun, and Joshua overwhelmed Amalek with the sword. Verse 15, Moses built an altar and called the name on it, "The Lord is my banner." And then notice what happens. We have in chapter 18 Jethro entering, Moses' father-in-law entering the narrative. And notice the way that Moses tells the story. Notice the way that Moses tells the story of God's salvation. Look what happens in verse 4. "The God of my father was my help and delivered me from the sword of Pharaoh." And I just wonder, how would we tell the story? How do we tell the story of our lives? Are we able to say, hopefully we are, just as we learn in one of the hymns that we sing, "The Lord has led me all the way." And then look at Jethro's response in verse 10. Jethro said, "Blessed be the Lord who has delivered you out of the hand of the Egyptians, out of the hands of Pharaoh, and delivered his people from under the hand of the Egyptians. Now I know that the Lord is greater than all gods, because in this affair they dealt arrogantly with the people." Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, brought a burnt offering sacrifice to God, and Aaron came with all the elders of Israel to eat it before him. But notice the heart of Moses here, and I want to point this out in our remaining time that we have left. Notice the heart of Moses. Moses' desire is for him to stand and judge the people in and of himself. He has I guess we could call it maybe a pastoral heart. He's a shepherd, remember? At least that's what he did with his father-in-law Jethro. And here he is shepherding the people of Israel even through the wilderness. Of course, their needs outgrow Moses. And so we have this commendation or this word of encouragement from Jethro in verse 17. Moses' father-in-law said to him, "What you're doing is not good. You and the people with you will certainly wear yourselves out, but the thing is too heavy for you. You are not able to do it alone. And so it's my prayer oftentimes when I think about what the Lord has called me to, or you think about what the Lord has called you to. One of the things that we need to be convinced of as we read the narrative today, to remember that God has not called us to do it alone. And this here alone is a reference back. Notice the way the Bible just unfolds here. It's a reference back to Exodus chapter 17, where Moses had to have two individuals that held his hands up. He had to have Aaron and Hur. Who are the Aarons and who are the Hurs in your life? There again, focusing on the Lord's salvation. Quickly to point out as we close our time, notice in chapter 19 there, in that section of, I guess it's verse 9 through 15. Verse 9 through 15, we have the third day reference. There we see the third day reference 3 times. And just pay attention in chapter 19 and verse 4. Notice the way the narrative unfolds and shows us the Lord's action. Remember, we're asking, as Moses told the story of God's salvation to his father-in-law Jethro, asking the question, how would we tell the story? How do we tell the story of our own lives? Well, here's the way that we tell the story. Look at verse 4. You yourselves have seen what I did to the Egyptians, and how I bore you on eagle's wings. And pay attention to this. I brought you to myself. Now, there's details as we close. Details in chapter 19. Something happens here on the mountain, something that we need to be aware of, and we'll come back to what happens on the mountain as Moses gives us further details in Deuteronomy of what happens. So, we will see the Lord and His kindness played out as we remember that He has called us to Himself to do His work in His power, and He'll raise up people to help us.